faster and faster and faster. He was terrified. He wanted to escape from them. And then he realized that in front of him, there was a high wall, and there was no way over that wall. And the men that were running and chasing him, they were the Sultan's men. They were determined to catch him, but they knew that he had got into the alleyway of no return, because at the end was the high wall. They knew inexorably he would be there, and they could kill him and take his dead body back to the Sultan as proof that they had fulfilled their mission. But when they arrived there, he'd vanished. He wasn't there. All that was there was an ivory box, a small ivory box, which was so beautiful they couldn't help but notice it. But where had Kassir gone? Sorry, where had Selim gone? They had absolutely no idea at all. But I know where he went, and I'm sure you'd like to know. So let me start the story at the beginning. Once upon a time, in a land far away, there were two friends, Selim and Kassir. Selim was a carpet and silk merchant, just like his father, his grandfather. And Kassir was a carver. He carved ivory and stone and wood and was the most finest craftsman. And Selim and Kassir were the best of friends. They always had been from a very early age. And as they grew up, they would share their thoughts and feelings with each other. They would walk through the bustling streets and alleyways of the city. They would ride on their white horses out into the woods to hunt. And one day they were riding in the woods on their horses, chasing after a deer. And they came upon two women who called out to them. They stopped. They got down from their horses to ask how they could help. And the women, one of them was quite beautiful. They were both very young. And she said, "Do not be deceived by my rags. I am highborn, but my father died, and I escaped from the kingdom. And we have journeyed far, and I no longer have fine clothes, and I no longer have gold. We are poor, we are destitute, we need help." And Selim, being a generous-hearted guy, said, "Of course, I would be willing to help you." But Kassir didn't have a good feeling about this, and he took Selim to one side and said, "Selim, my friend, I do not think this is a good idea. I do not think you should offer them your hospitality." But Selim, he was a silk and carpet merchant. He had a fine eye for beauty. Often he and Kassir would go together to the port to take delivery of the carpets and the silks. And once in the warehouse, the carpets would be laid out before him, and his sharp eye would detect any defect. And so, of course, all he could see was her beauty. Whereas Kassir, the carver of ivory, the artist, he could look further than the external beauty. He could look to the soul, and the soul made him very uncomfortable. But Selim was determined, and so the two women were offered hospitality in his house. And that night, the woman, who was actually a witch, as you've perhaps guessed, she had been thrown out by her father, who was sick of her magic and all of her misdeeds. And yes, she had wandered far. And yes, it was true she no longer had gold. And yes, it was true she was of high birth. But she was no orphan. And she may have been beautiful, but she did not have a beautiful soul. And that night, she sent her servant into the garden to collect 7 leaves from 7 bushes. She lit a fire, and she brewed up some magic. And as the magic took effect, her body shriveled and shriveled, and she became a small brown bird, and she flew out of the window, and she flew into the window of Selim's bedroom, and she alighted on his pillow. And that night he dreamed sweet thoughts of this beautiful maiden. And in the morning he determined that he would marry her. And he rushed off to see his best friend Kassir to tell him the good news, "I'm going to marry her." Well, as you can guess, Kassir was very unhappy with this news. He could not share his friend's joy. He did not feel this was a good decision. And they argued and argued. Harsh words were spoken, but they were such good friends. They cared so much about each other that they very rapidly reconciled. the wedding took place. But Selim's wife knew that Kasia did not trust her. She knew that he was suspicious of her. And one night, while he was working, while he was carving, it was a hot day, the window was open, and this black cat came in through the window. And as he looked up at the cat, he saw these very bright emerald eyes staring and staring with hatred, absolute hatred. And he wanted to work, and he pushed the cat away, but the cat pounced back at him, hissing and clawing at him. And he picked the cat up by the scruff of the neck and threw it onto the windowsill so that it had to go away, and shut the window down. Some fur was caught there, some black fur. He laid it to one side on his work table, thinking nothing of it. It was just a cat, a vicious cat. He tried to get on with his work, with his carving, but he just couldn't. He couldn't settle to it. He went to bed. And the next morning, he looked at the fur, but it wasn't fur anymore. It was hair, black hair, woman's hair. He knew immediately. And he went to his friend Selim and said, Selim, this is the proof. This woman that you have married, she's a witch. Here is the proof. And he told him the story of the black cat. And he showed him the hair. And of course, Selim would not believe him. And they had a bitter argument. And they were destined to never speak again. But the wife of Selim knew that in his heart, Selim missed Kasia. And she knew that she had to get rid of Kasia. And so she brewed some more magic. And he became ill. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He was fading away. The news reached Selim, and he rushed over to see his dying friend. But Kasia, knowing that he had been bewitched by this woman, that he was doomed, he was destined to die, he had called for materials and tools, and he had started carving, and he carved the most beautiful thing he had ever carved. He carved a beautiful ivory box. And to his trusted servant, he said, please give this to my dear friend Selim when I am dead, and tell him that if ever he is unhappy, to open the box and to look inside. And so when Selim arrived and discovered that his friend had already died, the servant handed him the ivory box, and he kept that box by him at all times. And he went on to prosper. And he prospered where other merchants did not. His ships were never wrecked. Other merchants, their ships were wrecked. And word went around town that maybe the wife of Selim was bewitching the other ships. Maybe she was the reason why her husband was so prosperous and the others were not. And they were very suspicious of him. They started to draw away from him. They were no longer friendly towards him. And he started to feel so unhappy. And one day he was wishing that Kasia was still there. And he took out the ivory box. Until this day, he'd never opened it. And he opened the box, but no, there was nothing inside. He thought there might be a letter from his friend, some words of comfort, some words of joy, something. But then he could hear water like a fountain. He could see in the distance a garden, and it was as if he was getting smaller and smaller, or the box was getting bigger and bigger. And he walked into this beautiful garden with fountains playing and the most beautiful plants. And there is Kasia. My friend, you have taken a long time. I am glad you've taken a long time to come. This means you have been happy. And Selim said, actually, no, I have not been happy. And today I decided I would open the ivory box and see if you had left me some message. And they walked and they talked. But Kasia said to him, do not shut the lid. If you shut the lid, there is no way back to your world. And eventually they parted company. And Selim went back to his world. But many times he would open the lid of that ivory box and walk in the garden with his dear friend. Meanwhile, his wife, the witch, oh, her ambitions knew no bounds. The Sultan was aging and the Sultan's son was very young. And her husband was so wealthy and so powerful that even the Sultan was borrowing money from him. And she thought, if that sultan were to die, my husband would be chosen as a sultan in place of him. She liked this idea. And so again, she got the 7 leaves from the 7 bushes, and she made magic, and she arranged so that the sultan would fall ill and not eat and not drink and fade away. And all the doctors in the land were called, and nobody could save him. He gave orders that no one was to enter his bedchamber. The witch, with more magic, made her servant into a blackbird and sent her off to the palace to discover what was happening with the sultan. He seemed to be taking quite a time to die. And the bird managed to fly in. But when it was seen and chased out of the room, it was shot with an arrow. But when it was found on the floor, it was no longer a blackbird, it was the servant girl. She was dying, and she denounced the witch. And so they rushed to the house of Selim and the witch. But the witch had already turned into a pigeon and flown away. But she met her fate. She was caught by a hawk and ended up in the forest where she was first found by Selim and Kassir. But meanwhile, Selim was a hunted man. And he ran from the house, and he ran down alleys. He ran to the left, he ran to the right. He could hear the footsteps coming behind him. He knew he was in the alley of no return. At the end was a wall. And he could hear their footsteps getting closer and closer. He took the ivory box out. He opened the lid. The box got bigger and bigger, or maybe he got smaller and smaller. But he was back in the garden with his dear friend, Kassir. And this time he shut the lid.
Wow.
Nice story.
Lovely story.
Lovely
Thank you.
story.
Thank you.
Gorgeous.
That's lovely.
I love the way you brought it full circle from the running of the
Very interesting. Very interesting, that.
It actually begins with them, there was 2 friends, and I decided to start it
I
at
like
the
you did
end
it.
and
Yeah, it's
twist
great.
it back round.
I really like that. Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
like
enjoyed
that.
that.
Really worked.
I threw myself off at the beginning because I said the wrong name, and then after that I was nervous that I would get the names mixed up.
It was really,
Well,
it was
it
very
worked.
clear, Gillian. Really,
Sorry?
it was really clear and beautifully told.
Thank you.
Yeah. Gosh, where is that from? That story?
It's actually from, it's actually from this book.
Barbara Leone Pickard.
Barbary Leone Picard.
I know that one. So
But I really liked it. I thought it was quite enchanting.
it's
I've kind of
obviously
shortened it. There's a lot more detail when you read it because it goes into the detail of the carpets, the forest, and everything, which I chose not to do.
Is it Persian?
It doesn't actually say where it came from, unfortunately.
No.
I'm guessing it's Eastern for sure, but none of these stories does she say where they come from. So,
Gosh, that's not very good.